Now, if you have dough, you buy a Mercedes 600, you drive, and everything is simple. In short, a consumption race has emerged. The consumption race has led to the exacerbation of the global environmental crisis. And when they wanted to prevent it, they invented Marxism and launched its promotion. Marxism was supposed to solve the problem of liquidation of this capitalism which generates a consumption race, and to build a planned economy that in general satisfies people's needs and at the same time limits the ceiling, because needs may be unreasonable. Well, let's say you live alone or live with your family, and now the idea visits you that you would like to build a palace. You are rolling in dough, you build the palace. Can you maintain it yourself? No. It will take a staff of servants that you have to hire. And someone sees you, he has even more dough. Well, let me build a super palace. You become jealous, again you make some dough, you bring in some cash, you build another super palace. Well, in general, a lot of people are jealous, and it turns out that we, as a civilization, waste the resources of the planet in vain, not satisfying the vital needs of the majority. And moreover, there is a growing hatred of the poor towards the rich, and so on. In such conditions, even those who rule can have problems, and may be killed inadvertently. Therefore, the question arises about some kind of social reorganization. And so they decided that Marxism should ensure the elimination of capitalism, the transition to a planned economy, eliminate such blatant social inequality, and work in general in such a way that the main mass remains under the power and does not set foot into the sphere of governance. Such was the Marxist project. It penetrated into Russia. In 1872, Marx's Capital was published in Russian for the first time. Lenin was 2 years old, he was walking under the table. Then interesting things begin, because if you read the literature of Russian writers, publicists of the 19th century, you will find such a thing. That man believed that work, this is to plow, to sow, to produce metal, to forge, to build houses and something else. And everything related to governance, this was not work, it was simply a conversation. And therefore, the broad masses of the people of Rus, they did not perceive as hard workers those who created enterprises, governed them. They did not realize that governance towards the state is also for the most part work. But this is conversations. Conversations, you understand yourself, anyone can do this. Those theories that Marxism proposed, they created the appearance that on their basis it is possible to govern the state. That is, behind Marxism there was always some mafia, which owned what in the West is called know-how. I know how, but this know-how is not spelled out anywhere. If you come to a guess, then good for you. If your Nravia standards correspond to the ruling mafia, you will join it. If you don't guess, well, these are your problems. But there is nowhere to read, and coming to this by thinking is also problematic. Because dialectics as an instrument of cognition, in general, was not studied in Marx's times, since it was actually replaced by the logics of Hegel. And basically Marxism ensured that the broad masses of people, after all, remained under the power, and that some kind of mafia behind-the-scenes team would steer. The representative of this behind-the-scenes mafia team in the Soviet Union was Trotsky. And Lenin and Stalin believed that socialism should be real, and democracy should be ensured. But since Marxism was popular, then to say that Marxism is a mistake and in general a harm, apparently Lenin did not come to this understanding. Stalin, however, understood this, but he could not say so directly. Therefore, in Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, Stalin has quite a few hints on this theme that Marxism is inconsistent. And Stalin demanded from science the development of theory. And science did not want the developing of theory, and it was believed that Stalin was a leader and teacher, and it was exclusively his duty to develop the theory. As a result, after the assassination of Stalin, the country remained as it was and gradually began to lose its sovereignty. As a result, we came to 1991, when the USSR was destroyed, and, in general, American advisors were sitting in the Kremlin, and the ministers only signed papers, there where they were shown to. Although the bulk of the governing documents were produced in the United States, translated into Russian, and if you look at the government documents of that era, there are quite a few tracing papers from English. Well, for example, the term flat tax rate. In the Russian language, such a concept could not arise, because, well, a convex scale of taxes, can you imagine? It is problematic. There may be differential taxation, equal taxation, but the term flat taxation came from English. They have such a concept, and it means equal taxation of all.
And what theory was required from science that Stalin demanded?
He demanded the development of the theory, but he did not say specifically to whom what to do.
Scientific work was actually carried out.
Yes, it was carried out. You see, one of Stalin's last works is the work Marxism and Problems of Linguistics. In actual fact, this work is not about Marxism, and it is not about linguistics. The main idea of this work is that mafia groupings were formed in science, which destroy the freedom of discussion, without which the development of science is impossible, and which have usurped the right to decide what is truth and what is scientific delusion. This was already under Stalin, and in his work Marxism and Problems of Linguistics, he opposed this. A few days before his death, he called Chesnakov. This was the secretary of the Gorky Regional Committee, and he said, "You must start developing the theory. We can mix something up in economic decisions, but this can be corrected. But if we get it wrong in theory, that's it."
i.e., this is the theory of building education, state governance.
Yes, this is what can be called scientific methodological support of state governance. Everything is there, about the economy, about education, about how society reproduces itself in the continuity of generations, what needs to be done, what categorically cannot be done. In essence, what the collective has done from 1987 to the present, this is the fulfillment of Stalin's behest on the development of theory.
It turns out that he spoke, but they didn't understand him.
Yes, they did not understand him. Take Marshal Golovanov, the creator of Soviet strategic aviation. During the war, Stalin was his immediate superior. He had no other bosses. That is, Stalin supervised his work and the work of all strategic aviation. And after 20 years, Golovanov recalled that Stalin tried to talk to him, and he was young and stupid, and he couldn't really have been bothered. I wish I could talk to him now. 20 years have passed. But Molotov did not fully understand, because Molotov believed that Stalin's work, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, in general, it contains a whole bunch of nonsense, and basically, Stalin confused some things. And Stalin's work, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, the main thing there, this is the idea that Marxism, as a theory, its political economy, is metrologically inconsistent. That is, the categories of political economy of Marxism cannot be correlated with what actually happens in life. But since Molotov was far from the processes of governance, and himself admitted that he began to luxuriate, and luxuriating is, here I am issuing instructions and you yourself will figure out how to incarnate this into life. Molotov did not understand the work of Stalin, Economic Problems of Socialism, right up to the end of his days. And he believed that Stalin confused some things there. Although really, it is a very deep work, but it is allegorical, for the very same reasons. To declare that Marxism is an artificial product with the aim of enslaving humanity, if Stalin had said this, he would have been attacked as an apostate, and maybe even killed before it was published. Because, you see, the psychology of the majority of people in the Rus is such that the head of state is responsible for everything. Further, people are divided into two categories. Some consider themselves obligated to do everything that the head of the state says, while others consider themselves not to be obliged to do this at all. And of those who consider themselves not to be obliged to fulfill all this, there is another group that considers it necessary to overthrow this head of the state, to organize some kind of power of their own, Navalny and this whole gang. But again, if you start looking, it always turns out that if some kind of opposition arises, then it is not ownerless for long, because there are always some foreign political forces that penetrate this opposition in order to harm Russia. And then either they succeed, or one of the heads of state gives the command to clean up the opposition. The faster the opposition is cleared out, the less problems there are in the country. Because, here's an example with the Decembrists. Half of those who were involved in this case were Masons. Freemasonry is not of an intra-Russian origin. It came to us from the West, and it was supervised by the West. But historians who study the question of the December uprising of the Decembrists, they do not delve into the theme of who and how led the Decembrists from the West. They are presented as super patriots of Russia who oppose the despotism of Tsarism, and about the fact that in general none of them wanted and did not know how to govern the state. About this they somehow in general remain silent. Mostly there was dissatisfaction, and this dissatisfaction may have been superimposed on theft in the Russian-American campaign in which the Decembrists were involved, that is, in the exploitation of Alaska.
It turns out that the same process took place in the middle of the 19th century. When Alexander II abolished serfdom, and when all these revolutionary clubs began to form, it all became fashionable. They tried to overthrow the Tsar in all different ways. Then they eventually split into two movements, and this led to what we got. That is, they tried to govern them too.
Yes, they tried to govern them too, and they were successfully governed. Herzen was kept by the Rothschilds.
I.e., in the end, all this led to the February Revolution.
Yes,
Nikolai II made some mistakes. Was he stupid or was he dictated to? And he simply followed orders.
he was willless. And basically it turned out that he was manipulated by who wanted it and how. And his wife was the favorite granddaughter of Queen Victoria. And since further there is a whole bunch of psychological connections, then his wife in general was a representative of the imperial British egregor. And England was considered their ideal. England was imitated. Well, in the end it turned out as it turned out. The Russo-Japanese War, this is a war in the interests of England. The First World War is also a war in the interests of England. When the February Revolution took place, the phrase was pronounced in the British Parliament, "One of the objectives of the war has been achieved."
To sum up, the world behind the scenes recognized the threat of the destruction of the biosphere. Through the uncontrolled siphoning of resources, something had to be done with this factor. And they decided to set an objective in relation to this factor. It was necessary to reduce consumption. And they decided to do this through the conception of introducing pseudo-socialism in the form of Marxism in society, through revolutions and other such movements.
You see, global power, it always made sure to maintain a balance so that no one became undividedly dominant. But the engines of the first Soviet jet fighters are licensed modified copies of British engines. And these licenses were already sold for the MiG-15 when the Cold War had already begun. This is 1945-1946. Further, if you look at the development of fleets, then it also turns out like this. The Soviet Union is banned from building aircraft carriers. The Americans are banned from the development of heavy anti-ship missiles.
As I understand, the first identification of the pressure of the factor of the environment is that there is an oppression by the bourgeoisie of the proletariat, and the root of all these evils is in private property.
No, this is already a plausible explanation for the crowd, because the problem was different. The consumption race destroys the biosphere and destroys civilization. Social tension due to the stratification into the super rich and the super poor becomes dangerous for the stability of society, because the rebellion of the poor is always a problem for the elite. The elite is a fool, does not want to do anything, and now lives as it does, in the hope that this will itself, somehow in some way, dissipate. It will not dissipate itself somehow, and it's necessary to reduce this social tension. That is why they decided it necessary to depict socialism in which there was no such division into super rich and the super poor, and there is no consumption race which uselessly grinds the resources of the planet. But at the same time, the people remain powerless, because politics is done on certain principles of know-how. It is done by mafia groupings that do not themselves stand out, but act through public social institutions, science, the system of education, the mass media, state power. But in reality, it turns out that if you were taught something at school, you cannot check all these theories for reliability. You take something on faith. If you practically do not work in this area yourself, then you are not faced with the fact that these theories are functionally inoperable. But when you start working in the sphere in which you work, you correlate what you were taught in school with what happens in life. On the basis of this, you work out some decisions, put them into practice. The result is a certain quality of life. If they teach different theories at school, then when you come to work, faced with the same information, you will work out different governorial decisions. Their implementation will generate a different quality of life. But the majority do not ponder on the fact that their behavior, including their professional behavior and behavior in politics, it is conditioned by those theories that were in school. Moreover, they do not ponder over the fact that these theories are being worked out for specific tasks. And if it's necessary to solve different political tasks, there will be different theories.
Well, for example, the economy that was conducted in the Soviet Union can in no way fit the economy that we need now. Therefore, when in economic institutions everyone is taught according to old textbooks, economists who lead these institutions are implementing a failed economy. Now, if we consider the policy of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, then it generally works not for those objectives that it itself declares. And from the point of view of what you just talked about, this theory of Marxism was not entirely consistent. And those who took it on faith and tried to implement without thinking with their own head, they faced errors, yes.
Well, what does the Communist Party of the Russian Federation do? Chattering on peri-communist themes. Because even if we talk about the position of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation on the changes of the constitution, Zhuganov said, we must vote against. What, Zhuganov published the draft constitution? Or did Zhuganov publish a draft of a phased transition from capitalism to socialism? No, that is, Zhuganov just blabbers, and gets paid for it, because the party in it receives funds from the state budget like a parliamentary party. Because if all these parties are transferred to membership fees, prohibiting sponsors from sponsoring them, but only membership fees, then the entire political system will collapse.
That is, in principle, we have now analyzed the factor of pressure of the environment. It seems to me that it is clear that the global predictor identified this factor of pressure of the environment, that if capitalism develops, then we will come to such overconsumption. But the formation of the skill of recognition, the second point of the entire function of governance, how can it be applied to this example?
In general, new concepts are introduced into the culture. So they introduced the concept socialism. Further, they wrote what socialism is, when the ownership of the means of production is public and not private. However, they did not disclose the concept property. Do you see how cunningly it turns out? The concept of property is intuitively clear. Private property is also understandable. But what is public property also seems to be understandable. But if it is public, then whose is it? Nobody's. Or yours, allocated for common use. And depending on how the concept of public property is interpreted, socialism either works or does not work. But when new concepts appear, life correlates with them, and what is being said is obtained. The recognition of the factor of the environment, the development of the skill of this recognition. So the skill of recognition is usually transmitted through various kinds of scientific theory, if we talk about some big things. But if there are little things, then it's like with COVID. On what is the skill of recognition based? A smear from mucous membranes and a microbiological analysis on the theme, are there antibodies to this COVID or not? But all the same, at the basis there also lie some theories.
Regarding the vector of objectives, that is, the vector of objectives was formed back when Marx wrote Capital.
The vector of objectives was formed earlier, because when Marx wrote his Capital, he simply fit with this vector of objectives.
That is, the global predictor had already formed its objectives, that it is necessary to limit this endless consumption on account of a new idea, and Marx had already announced this to the masses.
Yes.
What do you think about Engels?
Well, Engels wrote honestly to the measure of his understanding, but his understanding turned out to be also insufficient. You see, Marx is very verbose. Engels is shorter, because Capital is 3 volumes about economics, and Anti-Düring is one little book, with a little about everything. And Anti-Düring can be understood. There is quite a lot of common sense, but Capital is simply boring and tedious to read. There is factology. Therefore, without Engels, it would have been difficult to promote Marxism. There are simply books that are useful to read, regardless of the fact that they are the property of past eras, and there is a lot of nonsense. Anti-Düring, in particular, must also be read. Both your knowledge and personal development to date, it allows you to read and understand Anti-Düring.